All right, hello and welcome everyone to the Warframe Roster Review 2020. There are a bunch of brand new Warframes to discuss and old Warframes that have changed ranking, so that means it's time to talk about all of them. But before we get to that, we have to talk about something that hasn't changed much, and that is the rating system. So, starting that off, we have S, A, B, C, and D rank. S rank is for Warframes that are essentially completely busted. They're overwhelmingly powerful, and they're making it so that a lot of the rest of the entire roster of Warframes you have available in Warframe are just not useful. Basically, they're nonsensical and very likely to get nerfed. We've seen a few different variations of this pop up in the past, such as 99% Trinity and Map Blind Mirage, but you don't want a Warframe in this category because, just like the two I just mentioned, they're going to get nerfed and they're not going to be around because everyone knows how fucked up they are. Moving on, though, we have A rank. This is where you generally want a Warframe to be, as it means they are well-rounded, very effective, and just useful for a large amount of content, or the content they are very useful for is some of the most important content in the game that everyone is going to have to be doing. And then just below that, we have B rank, which, contrary to popular belief, does not mean bad. This is where the good Warframes are. They're solid. They have less advantages than the Warframes that are in the A rank, but very often they have some niche use that they are very good at. They just aren't used as much as the A rank Warframes, or are just have fewer advantages in general. And the same can be said for the rank just below B, which is C rank. This is for Warframes that are just okay. They have even fewer advantages than the Warframes above them, and generally they don't have any niche use case whatsoever. They're just there, and they do have powers, but the usefulness of them is more general only and less specific in many cases, or they just have a hard time with the content currently in the game. And then just beyond that, we have D rank, and D rank stands just very blatantly for don't. These are the Warframes that you just should not play. There's no reason that I could possibly come up with for you to choose this Warframe other than perhaps their looks, which doesn't count for much in this rating. So, with the ratings out of the way and discussed, let's jump into this. Starting with, of course, Ashe. We are doing this alphabetically, of course. So, Ashe has some advantages to him, but in general, he's mostly just kind of the actual ninja in this Space Ninja game, and he comes in at a B rank. He has some tools at his disposal. He has his 1 with his augment to get through armor. He has his 2, which is going to keep him invisible most of the time. And he has his 3, which can teleport him from target to target. Unfortunately for Ashe, the reason his rank dropped from a B plus to a B is because his 3 is just no longer good as a tool, with the nerf of daggers, which he was using as a stat stick, and in order to use the augment on his 3 to instant kill enemies. Without access to that, it makes Ashe a lot less versatile in terms of eliminating single targets, and it's just not as good. On the plus side, he does still have his 4, which is solid for taking out targets, but is just not going to get you there in the same way that teleport was previously, because these do have a limit to the damage they can do. It's not just an unlimited well. So unfortunately for Ashe, the nerfs to melee weapons are really what affected him in a negative way in this last year. And he's still good for general use, but just not as good for general use. Moving on. We have Atlas. So Atlas, unfortunately, much like Ashe, is moving down just a little bit this year, going from a B down to a B minus. This is, of course, unfortunate for him, as he did receive some changes, but they just have not been enough. The rubble that was added to him as a mechanic is just not strong enough, and even though he is able to punch enemies very hard with his landslide and eliminate a good number of them for many levels, his survivability really just can't match up. Tectonics is not a useful skill outside of some niche uses in the index where you can block off entrances for the enemies to score points. And his Petrify, while considerably better and definitely the second best ability in his kit, it's just not enough with his just to have his 1 and his 3 be good, and to have his 4 and his 2 be in such a sad state. The Rumblers are still just idiot rocks that are not very useful in any way, shape, or form, and it's very unfortunate to say that Atlas still needs buffs even after being reworked as much as he was. Continuing this unfortunate beginning downer talk, we have Banshee. So, unfortunately for Banshee, I probably overrated her last year at a B+, and this year I'm going to more accurately say that she is a C+. Banshee is actively being designed against. And what I mean by that is while her abilities do have upsides, like there are reasons to use them, her sonar is actively made useless by DE. They will not allow any enemy where this ability would be useful for increasing your amount of damage on them to be affected by this ability. And it means the main thing that Banshee has just is not useful. Even though she has the ability to armor strip on her 1 with the augment, and even though her 4 can like farm at low level missions, there are just Warframes that are doing that stuff better. And if sonar is not going to be her high level niche thing, she's not tanky enough for you to use. Like, she doesn't have a lot of survivability, and her powers aren't being allowed to be used. So plain and simple, she just cannot function as well as other Warframes because she is being essentially forcibly held back by D not giving her a thing to do. Now we have Baruch. So Baruch was new last year, but this year he has not changed at all in terms of rating, even after receiving a hell of a lot of buffs. And that is mostly due to me having overrated him last year at a B, and him actually realistically achieving a B this year. With the changes to melee and him getting some insane buffs with some of the mods that can be used on his 4 now, his 4 can be a critical monster and deal a lot of damage, and he's quite survivable. The problem comes from him just not being flexible enough in what Warframe needs. For Warframes, your powers need to work all the time, not just some of the time, not half of the time, all of the time. And Baruch has an extreme amount of downtime on Serene Storm. Whenever this ability is active, it's pretty solid. It's great even in some cases. But in general, you're just not able to just sit in this ability on a constant basis. There's not enough enemies to charge up from you using your other abilities, and it's just not enough of a flow where you're just constantly in Serene Storm. And I know the design of Baruch would dictate, obviously, that some of the time you're not going to be killing everyone, but in Warframe, that's literally what we need to be doing all of the time. So it really boils down that Baruch's core design can't really allow him to rise above this unless DE changes that core intent of him being a monk or whatever. So unfortunately for him, he remains a B, and I feel like it's unlikely for him to increase, although I would like to see that with his upcoming augments and things. Moving on, we have Chroma. Chroma has not changed at all. He was an A-, and he remains an A-. He is still extremely poorly designed, but DE keeps giving him things to do constantly. He just, if there's a problem where you need to do a bunch of damage to one big enemy, but they're affected by no abilities, then you bring Chroma to that mission. It turns out there are a lot of those missions in this game, and also he just tanks damage. So he's generally useful for pretty much all missions where you need to live, which turns out that's all of them. And he also does a fuck zillion damage, and the upkeep on that was made easier. So it works out. He has an incredibly useless 4th ability and 1st ability, but his 2nd and 3rd abilities are just literally required for some content, and that's where we are with Chroma right now. He's solid, usable, and needed for some things, and that gets him into the low A category, even though his overall design, in my opinion, is honestly terrible. Moving on. Finally, we get to talk about Ember. Ember was unfortunately a C- last year, but received a significant rework, so she has been bumped all the way up to a B+, just barely not making it into those A ranks because I think there are a few things that really hold Ember back. Even considering her rework, she was given a good amount of damage reduction from her 2, as long as you build the meter up a reasonable amount. But this same meter is what is holding her back. Whenever you build up her immolation meter too much, she receives a hefty energy drain, And having this punishment loop in Warframe is very unusual, I feel, and also just not productive for making Ember an attractive Warframe to use in a variety of content. So you have her 3, which lets you reduce the heat, but it's almost always more effective to reduce the heat by just turning off your 2 and turning it back on. So this ability is only ever really used for the armor strip, which is rarely useful in the levels that Ember can generally be comfortable playing at, I feel. However, I will say that the levels that she's comfortable playing at are usually fairly high. I would say the most comfortable level range for Ember is just things below level 100, which is pretty safe, and she can use her 4 to DPS fairly effectively in those levels due to the changes to heat procs. That is very positive for her, of course, and I feel like she's just a few tweaks here or there from really making it into A and, like, making a place for herself, but part of what also holds Ember back is the fact that she DPSs with her 4. So in a place like ESO, she really can't do anything, as you can't go do that mission and have a 4 be the thing you need to spam because it'll just lock you out of it. So she's locked out of that farm in specific where she would otherwise be excellent, which may in fact get her into A- if that were a thing. Unfortunately, it is not though. So moving on. We have Equinox. Equinox is in much the same way as Chroma, staying at an A-. So basically, the whole thing with Equinox is that she has 2 main uses and 2 forms. So she can change between her forms with her 1, her 2 is Rest and Rage, her 3 is Pacify and Provoke, and her 4 is Mend and Maim. But what this kit really boils down to is Rest is on your 2, Rage doesn't exist. Rest is a very effective sleep skill that allows you to just stay very, very safe and kill all the enemies without them being able to fight back. So that's useful. And then you have Maim. Maim is your day form ability. That is what is used for DPSing with Equinox. And having 2 Equinoxes in a party allows you to do what is known as patty caking. That is very useful at a high level, where you activate your 4, you build up a bunch of damage, and then the other Equinox has their 4 activated. You pop your 4, which fills up the other Equinox and kills everything in the room. And then you reactivate your 4, and the other Equinox fills your Maim up, and that just loops back and forth forever as you completely wipe the floor with all enemies that enter your vicinity. Basically making Equinox the meta for large area map clear. And it also helps that this can be done in ESO, where normally you would be locked out of your 4 for spamming it, because this ability doesn't need to be spammed. You activate it quite slowly back and forth if you're using 2 Equinox, and you only use it to wipe a large group of enemies whenever you're using it by yourself. So it turns out only having 2 of her 7 abilities be useful is still really good on Equinox because these abilities are so overwhelmingly powerful. And if that were ever to change, Equinox would be in a very, very sorry state, much like the condition where Chroma is right now. Now let's talk about Excalibur, the poster boy of Warframe. So, for Excalibur, he has moved down just slightly from an A to an A-, and this is mostly due to the tankiness required for content going up. Previously, Excalibur was survivable enough to never have any trouble surviving content, but recently that has changed, and you combine that with his 4 not being as good because of the melee rework, where a lot more melee weapons are much more comparable to his 4 now, and he just has a lot less advantages than he had previously. He's still very capable. He can use his 4 to do a lot of damage. He uses his 2 to really lock down enemies and not have any trouble surviving whenever he's spamming his 2 anyway. But that's most of what he's got. His 1 is only really useful for movement, and his 3 is a really big relic of the past. So he's really just surviving off the just flexibility of his 2 and his 4 to be able to do a wide variety of content easily enough. Who knows how long that will last as the Sentient Slayer becomes less and less relevant as sentients become more and more relevant. Let's talk about Frost. Frost, I have given considerably too much credit for far too long. His previous rating was an A-, but I have to move Frost all the way down to a B ranking. And this really comes into focus whenever we talk about the Warframe we're going to discuss right after this. But the general gist of it is that Frost is not tough enough for this meta, and he doesn't have enough uses anymore. His 4 at this point is pretty much purely CC as general enemy levels rise, and his 3, while good for defending single targets, can only really defend stationary targets, and moving targets are also fairly common now. And your allies aren't just going to sit in the bubble anymore. We're just not in that place where defense is like the main game mode for farming things. And his 2 just isn't that useful because it's just slowing enemies, which you can do better with your 4. And his 1 is really only here to pop snow globes, which are also often getting in the way of your teammates because Frost is the person generally in a squad that needs that snow globe to be able to survive. All this stuff compounds with him just not being a tank and him just not providing enough to a squad that is on the move doing the new content that we're doing. So, unfortunately, Frosty Boy's on ice, and we're not probably going to be seeing much of him for the foreseeable future unless he receives a rework. But who is going to replace Frost, you may ask? Well, the person who is replacing Frost at every place I turn is Gaara. Gaara has moved from an A rank up to an A+ rank, and she really deserves it. Every single time content gets released, it's like, oh yeah, Gaara is good at that. And it's because her kit is just so versatile and it's allowed to do everything. She has her 1, which is a damaging ability that is really only here to synergize with her other abilities, but that synergizes so well with her 4, which we'll get to in a minute, that it really doesn't matter that this is more of a utility, and the fact that it has a knockdown as a bonus is just fine. The real star of the show for Gaara is Splinter Storm. This ability is nonsense. You can throw 90% DR on yourself, allies, inanimate objects, just everything. If it's friendly and it has a health bar, you can put Splinter Storm on it. And as a bonus, even beyond that, you can put this on enemies so you do more damage to them. So not only is this a wide use defensive ability, it is also used offensively to buff your weapon damage and your team's weapon damage whenever you put it on enemies. And if even that was not enough, this ability, when combined with your 1 and your 4 together, has infinite stacking damage in an AoE around you, allowing you to simply walk up to enemies and eviscerate them. That is absurdly strong, and it's only getting more powerful as time goes on and more content is like just good for Gaara to be in. And if that wasn't enough defensive stuff, she has Mass Vitrify, which not only is a mass AoE kill skill for low-level enemies, great for low-level farms, but also can defend points and is what is used to stack up the damage on your 2. If you have not used Gaara to her fullest potential and don't know what I'm talking about, I would really, really advise you to go watch my video on Gaara so you can understand it, because she is exemplary and is so useful and also so very easy to get early-ish on in the game from PoE. So I would recommend her highly if you are looking for a Warframe and you are new-ish to the game. Kind of on the opposite of the spectrum, we have Garuda. So Garuda I previously rated at a B+, and honestly, I had too much hope for this Warframe, and I think most of that comes from me loving her style. She is moving from a B+ all the way down to a C+, and that mostly comes from her kit just really not making much sense. This is a melee Warframe that really wants to get in there with her 1, but when you do, you get this front-facing single-direction shield to protect yourself. And that is the only real way you have to protect yourself outside of generic mods that any Warframe can use. And it just doesn't flow well in gameplay. You jump in and you get into the middle of the fray with your claws and you get your blood ball in order to start like building up to do some damage. And you're only protected from one direction. Being surrounded is very common whenever you go in to do this, and it's often going to get Garuda killed if you're not utilizing a ton of defensive mods that really clog up her builds. With that, she does have her 2, which can allow her to heal, which would be great if she had a more all-around protective solution, but because she doesn't, you're usually just going to die in one hit at any kind of a higher level piece of content, and the healing's not going to have mattered. With that, her 3, of course, gives her an amazing energy economy, as you combine her 3 with her 2 for unlimited energy very, very easily. But it just ends up that her powers are not impactful enough at keeping her alive in order for her to get to the DPS part of her kit, which is her 4 plus her 1 hold. So her 4 sends out these spines that make it so enemies have a very large chance to get bleed procs on them. Of course, slash procs are insanely powerful, one of the highest DPS things you can do in the game in general, but this ability doesn't really see a whole lot of use because, once again, kind of the same problem we had on Banshee, the enemies that this would be really, really useful on are immune to status or are completely immune to this ability in general. And that tendency for DE to make enemies status immune means really that this ability is just honestly probably never really going to see its actual full potential because it can do a ton of damage, just not to targets that matter. So unfortunately for Garuda, she has moved down into the C category. I would really, really love to see her be better because I love the flavor and design of this Warframe, but she's just not there right now. All right, finally we get to talk about Goss, or Gauss. I don't really care how you pronounce it. Goss is a speed fucking monster, and it greatly pains me to say that he is only an A-. He is an exceedingly good Warframe that has a couple problems that really prevent me from giving him any kind of a higher rating as much as I would love to. Basically, the main issue with Goss is that while he does have an exceedingly high amount of damage reduction, up to 100%, but only specific damage types, and he has these huge buffs to fire rate, attack speed, reload speed, and holster speed, and of course, just like the general damage and lockdown versatility that comes with Thermal Sunder, especially at low levels where this can just wipe maps, and of course, he's very, very fast with Mach Rush, being able to jump around very, very quick, and also animation cancel many melee weapons, making him an extremely powerful and potent melee Warframe. The big downside comes from needing to move as much as you do. There are a lot of game modes in Warframe that really just don't support the amount of movement that Goss needs. Whereas we have some new Warframes, new Warframe game modes like Disruption, where moving around is extremely incentivized, and Goss is at his absolute best there, and it is an exceeding amount of fun. We also have a lot of game modes that are still very valuable, like Defense and Interception and everything to do with Railjack, where the amount of movement you're going through is just not that much, and your abilities just aren't going to be charged on the regular. So, whereas Goss is going to be very, very good at stuff like Capture and Disruption, and like Exterminate he's pretty reasonable at, and like these regular game modes, a lot of those game modes are very easy, and anything that relies on you being in a small space for any extended period of time, like any kind of a boss fight or anything of that nature, he's just not going to be nearly as good at, unfortunately. But yeah, Goss, one of my favorite Warframes, even like currently at this point, super fun. Would suggest getting him just as a personal recommendation, even if he's not like an A+ Warframe. Okay, let's talk about Grendel. Grendel, fat boy, hungry man. He eats motherfuckers. Unfortunately, eating motherfuckers is not that good, and I've only given him a B+. This fat, tanky boy is really hard to take down, but unfortunately, his eating enemies thing is highly limited. There are a large amount of enemies in this game that he's just not allowed to consume, or whenever he consumes them, it just does pitiful damage that is not very relevant, and it can't really justify the amount of drain you're going to experience when you've eaten these enemies. While the drain may look low on paper, as you can see in this ability screen, 1.5, that is a per enemy drain, and this can be very, very high, very, very fast, and it also ramps up the longer you've eaten enemies, so it is unfortunately very difficult to keep up enough energy on Grendel. On the upside, he is extremely hard to kill. Between Nourish giving you the ability to heal and his very sizable health pool, it's going to be extremely difficult to keep him down. Regurgitate is a useless ability. Sadly, it needs something to go with it. Hopefully an augment can fix this at some point. And he has Pulverize, or Meatball, if you'd like to go with the in development name. And this ability is actually hugely useful. I was very surprised. This essentially gives you a lot of AoE kill potential at many levels. Obviously, at the very, very high end, like level 150 plus, this ability is not going to do a whole lot. But when you've eaten a host of enemies and then start bouncing around with Pulverize in like ESO, it will wipe maps. And it's very impressive to see it at its full potential. The one downside to that, again, is that you need to be full of enemies in order to do this, and one of the few places you can actually accomplish that where the spawn rate is actually enough to get you there is ESO, and in regular maps, you are usually going to go hungry, and for that reason, he is in the B+ area. Hopefully he sees a few tweaks here and there to really bring him up and make him maybe a little bit more versatile and able to do things without relying so much on being able to eat 10 enemies, as that is kind of a big ask with the low spawn rates we've been experiencing in Warframe lately. But yeah, much more solid than I expected him to be on release. He is extremely fun. Hiro, why are you this way? Unfortunately for Hiro, I am moving him down from previously a B+ all the way down to a B-. Hiro he just has not proven himself to be a very useful Warframe. He was previously a B+, and I gave him just too much credit. He has the same exact problems of just being an incredibly greedy support who wants to do everything themselves, but it's really shown through over the course of time that I've seen Hiros around that he doesn't do anything in a party that's actually effective. In a party where you're babysitting some players and doing most of the work and keeping them healed and giving them energy and stuff, he'll be a good time. But if you're in a party with players that actually know what they're doing, Hiro's unlikely to even have the chance to get some kills and give you energy or give you health, and your teammates generally aren't going to need that health, and the energy might just be kind of a bonus for a lot of the Warframes that are kind of dominating the meta right now. So, unfortunately for Hiro, he just doesn't have what it takes. He doesn't have that instantaneous response or like that big buff that he can just dish out to allies and just have always be on them. And it's really unfortunate, the place where Hiro has kind of fallen to and just not been useful. But hopefully at some point we see some changes to him that can make him more versatile or more of an instantaneous support rather than a support that needs to do the whole mission themselves. Anyway, moving on. Hildren, many of you may call her mommy, but I call her C+. This Warframe is just very, very put simply, just not good. Like, you have a 1 that is a glorified staticore, honestly, more so than anything else, and it's very underwhelming. You have a 2, which is mediocre at best, but is your way to generate more shields, so you kind of have to be able to use it. And you have a 3, which honestly I would never suggest you turn on because it's just a drain for no reason that your allies don't need. And then you have your 4, which is like, what if you played Anthem in Warframe? Spoiler, Anthem wasn't good, and neither is this. So basically what this boils down to is Hildren being a one thing Warframe, and that thing honestly isn't that good because I'd much prefer to use a melee weapon over her 1. So all this coming together to say that the only reason she has a plus is because her passive is a shield gate, and that shield gate can technically be used in Railjack because you can use that shield gate on the Archwings you're piloting if you play as Hildren, and she has enough survival with her gimmick build, which utilizes 2 full sets of arcanes in order to keep resetting her shields to max, in order to make it so that you're tanky enough to be essentially invulnerable if it loops properly. So nothing to do with her powers other than her passive is good about her, but her passive can sometimes be exploited for profit. So that's kind of where Hildren's at right now. Not a good spot to be in to have, let's call it, half of a good ability in totality. So yeah, bad place for Hildren to be at right now. Unfortunate. All right, let's talk Hydroid. So, Hydroid, previously rated at a B, has moved down to a B-, and this is for one specific, very, just honestly, probably very obvious reason. They changed how loot abilities work, and that makes Hydroid way worse because a lot of the rating of Hydroid was his ability to use his 4 to loot enemies, and Korra literally does that better now, and Hydroid and Korra don't stack. So, by proxy of that, Hydroid has moved down in rank. Hydroid is very fine at doing a number of things, and there's definitely the potential that I'm giving him even a little bit too much credit as it stands, but having a looting ability is still very good because we need to do that in Warframe most of the time, turns out. And he can be kept very safe if you can get used to his playstyle, and the amount of damage he can dish out is occasionally pretty impressive. With all that said, though, he is just a B-, and it is like really unfortunate that the loot changes came as they did to affect him in this way. Moving on. Annerose. So there was a part of this last year where I had my doubts, and I might have said that Annerose had moved down to just being an A ranker, but recent developments have solidified him as a definite A+ Warframe. He is still fucking invincible, and he still does not fucking care what you throw at him. He doesn't need his powers to tank, so every time DE is like, hey, we're going to turn your powers off or fucking whatever, he says no, and instead decides to tell them to fuck off and continues to not die. He doesn't care. He has the ability to heal himself and his team massively while also crowd controlling enemies. He has a nice crowd control ability, which sometimes comes up. He has an extremely long stun and enemy repositioner, which occasionally comes up. And his one is a giant AoE blind, which makes it so enemies can even less so succeed in killing him. He has a lot going for him. The only significant downside that he's received over the course of this last year is losing out on covert lethality daggers, because those got nerfed into oblivion and are no longer a thing. So he can't do covert lethality plus desiccation anymore, and will have to resort to more traditional means of murdering his enemies. Still, though, and very clear from the usage statistics we've seen, Annerose is the solution most people have gravitated towards as DE continues to design content in a way where our powers don't matter sometimes. Annerose's bulk always matters, as it turns out. Evaro, having recently received a Prime, is an excellent Warframe, but has moved down from an A+ down to just an A. This Warframe is extremely powerful and good, and is used in a number of affinity farms, loot farms, and is just very good at kind of all content. She's the Hunter Warframe that is used for getting rep in both the Plains and Fortuna, and she's constantly invisible. This invisibility doesn't have a timer on it. It never ends, and it gives her a damage bonus, and it's also a looting ability. Her 4 does an incredible amount of damage. It can DPS extremely effectively and take out hordes of enemies if you put punch through on it. There are a lot of advantages here. And even beyond all of that, there's also the benefit that she can actually be used as a DPS for some boss fights. You can hunt Eidolons with Evaro with her too. And I know that is a non-traditional use of her 2, because the traditional use of her 2 is to never use it, but that is literally a build that people do take Evaro for, and is worth mentioning here. Beyond that, of course, she can make her allies invisible, and then, of course, she has the sleeping, just large groups of enemies. Evaro is like the main choice if you're going to be doing interception farms, because she can just put the whole map to sleep, and then when every enemy that spawned is asleep and the game can't spawn anymore, you fucking win, it turns out. So Evaro is incredibly versatile, great for a lot of different game modes, and the only reason she's lost her plus is really because for much of what we do in Warframe, she's just a little slow at it. She has like just some delay on things, basically. Her 3 restricts her movement, and like just in general, there's a lot more active farming that we're doing now, and she's kind of more settled into a solo farmer's Warframe as opposed to being used in a lot of groups or anything like that, outside of course, looting groups, as she is the while alive looter of choice. Korra, I never thought I'd say this, but Korra has moved up from a B+ to an A-. Korra, given her new augment, has taken hold as the on-death, like, loot Warframe of choice. enemies that are caught in her 4, which is a solid enough crowd control ability, and also an add to her DPS in a lot of cases, will give you more loot when you equip her augment. And that is very useful because given that she can do significant DPS with the melee changes affecting her 1 and giving her access to Blood Rush, means that she can deal a ton of damage with Whip Claw. That damage gets spread out to everyone in the Strangle Dome, and then it kills all of them and you get a ton of loot. This is a way more effective loot strategy than using Hydroid, and also it does slash damage, which synergizes very well with Necros, who is the other loot frame that's definitely going to be in your party, and it just all comes together to make her an extremely good looting Warframe. And on top of that, she's quite survivable between using her 2 and her 4 to crowd control enemies and also deal more damage with her 1, and also just having enough bulk if you invest a good deal of Forma in her to be able to survive at these levels, and having the healing from Venari back that up even further. Really just a Warframe that really came into their own and is just very, very good now. Very happy to see that the augments really gave Korra more of a place, and definitely the changes to how looting works were very kind to her as well. Moving on. Limbo. So I came to a realization at some point during the last year, and it was that I never cared if a Limbo was in a mission or not, and if they were in the mission, I constantly wondered why they weren't Gaara. And what that really made me realize is that Limbo does not belong at A-. Limbo belongs at B. He doesn't do anything that is actually truly exemplary, and his mechanics are unique, and he can be useful for a number of things, and he can dish out a number of an amount of damage that is quite good, and he's a very safe Warframe in terms of his survivability when played correctly. But he's just not that useful whenever there's other Warframes that can do a lot of what he can do and also aid the team in other ways. Like, really what it boils down to is, if you really enjoy Limbo's gimmick, you're probably going to play Limbo, but he's not bringing anything to the table you couldn't get elsewhere. Speaking of not bringing anything to the table that you couldn't get elsewhere, we are moving Loki down from an A-. Yes, that's right. The Loki Master Race is being moved down from an A- down to a B-. What I really ended up realizing is that Loki only has invisibility at this point. Like, his 4 is being utilized for fucking nothing anymore, and his 1 is not being utilized for anything, and his 3 is only being utilized for trolling other players. And really, being a B- is only because invisibility is that good. His 2 is just that good. His other 3 abilities don't really matter, but being very fast and being invisible all the time is a super solid way to be. Given that, he also has his 4 that can occasionally be useful. It hasn't been useful for a long time, but the potential for that situation to arise where you want it is there, and it is worth noting. And it's kind of the reason he is still in B-, even given all of these other Warframes that have invisibility and are doing it better than him at this point. Now let's talk about Mag. So for Mag, I had previously rated her at a B+, but she's going to be moved down just slightly to just a B. I think this is reasonable given the way where Warframe has moved into this kind of just way higher damage environment, and like just the levels of things have gone up. It's just less safe to be Mag because she's a Warframe where her survivability is kind of always in question. And that's very unfortunate. There are a number of tweaks I think that could be made to Mag to make her much more survivable and allow her to still use her powers to DPS very effectively as she does currently. But with the general damage in Warframe going up quite a bit, I would say, using her 4 to survive just isn't as effective as I'd really like it to be. Because her 4 and her 3 combined, her 3 with the augment, of course, to survive is effective enough if you're really going for it, but it just takes away from what you could be doing, and I think there are other Warframes that are excelling where Mag fails, and those areas are very important. So what it essentially comes down to is Mag still needs some more work, but she's better than Loki, which is a thing I never thought I'd fucking say. All right, it's time to talk about one of the greats. Obviously, disclaimer, Mesa is my favorite Warframe, but allow me to tell you why Mesa is so fucking good and remains as an A+. Mesa has a lot going for her. Her 2 is a damage buff for you and one ally at a time. It rotates. That is also crowd controlling enemies. So, great stuff there. Her 3 gives you 95% damage reduction whenever you mod properly. This lasts for a good long while, and that's stellar. And then on top of having a lot of damage reduction, a stun, and a damage boost, she also has Peacemaker. Peacemaker allows you to eliminate large swaths of enemies really, really fast, and it increases in damage the more your focus increases, allowing you to take down even very, very tough targets that are susceptible to it, like Sentience and a number of other targets. This is, of course, incredibly useful, mostly because you can mod it with secondary mods, giving you just a huge amount of damage potential, and it is just insanely useful. You can be very mobile with Peacemaker, using it in the air and such, and with the augment, you can move around during it, which makes this very valuable for doing an ESO, because it means you don't need to spam your 4 anymore. And she's just really great in general at all the things we need to be doing right now in Warframe, which is killing large swaths of enemies and not dying. That's pretty much what it boils down to, and that's what she's here for. All right, Mirage. Mirage is the winner of the I wish they significantly reworked this Warframe because she has such huge potential to be amazing award, and we have moved Mirage down from a B to a B-. So, what does Mirage have going for her? She has a 1 that duplicates her weapons and increases the damage of them via doing that, of course. She has a 2, which is pretty much completely and totally useless, and she has a 3, which sometimes gives you a huge damage increase, and other times gives you a huge damage reduction on yourself. Unfortunately, this ability cannot be properly controlled and is subject to the lighting condition that you happen to be currently in. Unfortunately, lighting conditions are just not really a thing you can control, so this is a really inconsistent ability that is a huge pain in the ass to take advantage of and sucks. And then her 4, previously an ability that had made her an S-rank Warframe, this ability was nerfed significantly and no longer blinds through walls and the like, so this remains an ability that you're just never going to cast, and anyone utilizing Mirage is pretty much just going to be using her 1 and her 3 in order to deal a lot of damage usually. And of course, her 1 can abuse AoE weapons by multiplying the AoE and such like that. So I really fucking hope Mirage gets reworked because she deserves it. Honestly, her kit could be so much better. Okay, let's talk about Necros. So, Necros has really not changed very much, but the game has sort of changed around him. I have moved Necros up from an A- to an A ranking, and the reason for that is even though people only use Desecrate on Necros, this is the only ability that is really ever used on him, occasionally Terrify. Even with that, Desecrate is probably one of the single most used powers in Warframe for a reason. This is the primo getting extra loot ability. So you're going to use it a lot. A ton of parties need a Necros to get that more loot, and you're going to be combining him with the other Warframes that don't stack with each other. If it had gone a different way, we might be living in a world where a party is like Korra and Hydroid together and stacking those or something, but we don't live in that world, and you're stacking Necros plus the other loot Warframes. It's always going to be that way, unless they introduce another better on-death loot Warframe, but that doesn't seem to be on the horizon anywhere from where I'm sitting. So Necros is what he is. He is honestly kind of just unnecessary evil. You build him so that he doesn't die, and you use his Desecrate augment so that you use health instead of energy, so that it is just constantly and always going. and then you call it a day pretty much. That's what Necros does, and that's what he's for, but it is so useful that it must be recognized, and he kind of must be in A ranking. Neja. So, Neja has not really changed at all. The rework for Neja was amazing, and Neja remains as an A+. He is an incredibly versatile Warframe, and is essentially, in most cases, fast, slightly less tanky Rhino, utilizing his 1 to go very quickly. This was also worth noting, I suppose, minorly buffed in that the heat procs from this are way more useful now. His 2 is useful with its augment for getting a bunch of damage on enemies, and also there are a few cases where debuffing enemies with the chakram is a great way to get a lot of bonus damage on tough enemies. And then his 3 is fantastic for putting on yourself, and in some cases every once in a while you'll use the augment to put this on allies, which is also useful. And his 4 is solid crowd control that has a significant downside in that there are a number of enemies this doesn't work on, sadly. But it's still a solid crowd control ability that you can use to take down enemies very easily with no problems whatsoever. Really, his kit just comes together with his passive that allows him to be insanely fast. And for any missions that you're going to want to stay safe and farm incredibly quickly, he is a primo choice for that. So that's where he sees his use, and it turns out that's very useful right now in Warframe. Nidus. So Nidus is... I like Nidus. I really do. But, much like Banshee, they keep designing content in a way that doesn't allow Nidus to flourish. So we have to move Nidus down from an A down to a B+. There keeps being these cases where Nidus can't interact with enemies, so he can't build his stacks, or he loses his stacks whenever he's trying to do this relevant content, or if he just does his stuff too slow, and he can survive things, and he can build up, and he's sometimes very good for boosting the power strength of other Warframes and such, but on the whole, it just takes Nidus too long to do things right now. We don't have that build-up time available, or that build-up is immediately canceled out by just the mechanics of what we're doing right now in Warframe. And that's really sad to say, because I feel like Nidus is one of like the better designed kits in Warframe that just doesn't have anything to do with it. It's just not as cut and dry as some of the more simple Warframes that just do their thing at the press of a button. Combining all of the mechanics on him together takes time, and we don't have that time right now. So it's very sad for me to say that Nidus is at a B+. Nova. Nova was an A+ and remains, shocking literally fucking nobody, as an A+. Nova is used for such a wide variety of content. She is used in any kind of a speed farm because she's one of 2 Warframes that can speed enemies up, and she's the only one that can do it efficiently so that they get into your death area faster. And on top of being used in farms, her 4 can be inverted to slow enemies massively, greatly reducing the amount of damage that they can do to your party and the speed at which they move. And her 4 also makes it so your entire team does double damage to all enemies affected by it. If that was not enough, Wormhole makes her an exceedingly fast Warframe, being able to get from place to place in the blink of a fucking eye. And she has antimatter drop, which, when combined with an appropriate weapon, allows her to just dump 100,000 damage bombs all over the map and just wipe squads. And her 1 gives fucking damage reduction per particle. You get 5% damage reduction per particle on your health, not your shields. And that gives her a very hefty amount of survivability when combined with quick thinking. So it's hard for her to die. She's very good at debuffing enemies. She's super fast, and she can do a bunch of damage to boot. And that's just an overwhelming amount of positives and not really any fucking negatives. So yeah, Nova's great. Surprise. Now let's talk about the other side of the coin. This is Nyx. They tried a little to help Nyx out, but honestly, where I am right now is that she was at a C-, and this is our D rank Warframe. I cannot find any fathomable good reason why anyone would play this Warframe in her current state. Mind Control is a bad ability, but a better version of this ability exists on a different Warframe. Psychic Bolts sucks. Like, just plain and simple, it's just not a good enough debuff, and, like, it's just not worth casting ever. Chaos is just, honestly, ineffective crowd control. There are a million better solutions. And her 4, while it can be used with an augment to kind of sort of tank things, it slows you down to such a degree, it makes me ask the question, why aren't you Hildren? And at the point where I'm asking, why aren't you Hildren, that means this Warframe is a D rank Warframe. Because, like, Hildren's not even using abilities. Her passive does that for her. It doesn't even use energy for Hildren to do what Nyx can use a ton of energy to do. And it's a sad fucking state of affairs, because I would love for Nyx to be good. She has so much, like, good-looking cosmetic stuff that I'd be able to utilize if she was a halfway decent Warframe. But the fucking facts are there that she's just not. Nyx just isn't good, and it sucks to say. She's just the worst Warframe in the game right now, I think by quite a bit, and that's messed up. Let's talk about the GOAT now. So, Oberon has changed not at all. He is still an A-. He's just here doing GOAT stuff. He's still used in the Eidolon party. He has some additional benefits in that he can buff himself with his 1 now, so he's able to access a very large radiation damage buff whenever he needs to. His 3 allows him to be immune to status, which is, of course, only really useful in the Eidolon fight, but still, it comes up. His 3, buffing you and the whole squad, being able to heal lures, just being able to do anything that it can interact with and heal is great. The only way this could really be better is if it could heal as many things as Gaara's 2 could protect. That would be very nice. And then his 4 is occasionally useful for getting rid of armor, but at low levels, it can also nuke rooms, so it's got some decent things going for it. He's just a versatile tank that can also support in a very active and helpful way, and also he synergizes very specifically with certain Warframes that utilize armor to do stuff, like, for example, Rhino, which we're, of course, going to get to fairly quickly here. Octavia. So, many of you will be surprised to know that Octavia I am still not putting at S rank. She remains at an A+ rank, and this Warframe is insanely powerful. I cannot express enough how strong this Warframe is, but no one's using her. And part of the requirements for a Warframe to get into an S rank category for me is that they have to be, like, meta. Like, people need to be using them and, like, exploiting how insanely powerful they are, but no one's doing that with Octavia. And everyone always tells me it's because that she's not, like, enjoyable for a lot of people and stuff, but the facts really do still remain that she is insanely powerful. She has a gigantic damage buff. She has, like, speed buff, multi-shot buff, damage buff, constant invisibility, armor buffing. Like, her 2, like, CCs a bunch of enemies in, like, a gigantic area. Her 1 has infinite scaling damage whenever you throw it out that kills enemies in, like, a fairly large area. Like, she has a ton of good shit about her. But people just don't really use her that much. Like, that's really what it boils down to. This Warframe is overpowered, but no one's using it, so I guess it's not a problem. That's really what it comes down to. She's an A+ because she's insanely good, but she can't make it into S if no one uses her. And that's just kind of where we are with it. Like, that's just what's going on with Octavia. Revenant. So, Revenant is a B ranker. That has stayed the same. He was B ranker before, he's a B ranker now. He is used generally for his 4, just wiping out hordes of enemies, which he can do reasonably well, even if it is at a high energy cost. But in general, you are going to spend most of your time recasting Mesmer Skin in order to stay alive. This ability, very sadly, has a really long casting time, and the synergy with Reeve cannot be utilized unless your enemies are under the effect of Enthrall, which is your better version of Nyx's 1. Unfortunately, having a better version of a D-rank Warframe's 1 isn't really enough, and I honestly think that if they just removed the restriction on Reeve to restoring your Mesmer Skin stacks from needing Enthrall, that Revenant would be a much, much better and more reasonably survivable Warframe. But as it stands currently, he's just not good enough in enough ways. Like, he can survive with his 2, but he needs to be able to utilize his 3 in a more effective way to really get there. because his 2 I just think is not effective enough defense whenever you can't use your 3 very easily to restore it. But yeah, Revenant, very just middling in my opinion, unfortunately, because I think he looks real fucking cool. Rhino. So, Rhino is still, of course, the primo new player Warframe, and also, he has that insane high end. He is an A+ Warframe, and he is a staple of, I think, anyone's arsenal that has been playing this game for a long time. Rhino Stomp, insane crowd control, great for low-level farming. Roar affects pretty much everything in the entire game, except for railjack weapons now that that got patched. This is a huge damage increase, second only to Chroma's damage increase, and it has a very wide range and lasts for a long time on your full party, so that is a huge benefit. Iron Skin, of course, there's builds for this that I use on a pretty constant basis. They get you up into like the 100,000 plus Iron Skin range, making you completely fucking invincible to all these enemies, and this makes you status immune, unknockdownable, etc. And his 1 is used in the combo for getting that Iron Skin up to that insane level and making him just impossible to stop. He is just the tank. His like robustness for his kit is what I think should be applied to more Warframes across the game. And the only criticism I could possibly level at Rhino is that I think his 2 should be refreshable by default. That's literally it. If his 2 did not need an augment in order to be refreshable, he would be, I think, a literally perfect Warframe. And it is... he's just exemplary. Just a fantastic Warframe. If you don't know how to use Rhino, I would very much suggest that you go check out my most recent builds video for him. In much the same vein as Rhino, let's talk about Sarin. Sarin is one of the premier damage Warframes in Warframe, and she was an A+ and remains an A+. She is extremely powerful and synergetic, and what she lacks in overall bulk, she greatly makes up for in just the insane amount of damage she can put out with her spores. Spreading her spores to all the enemies in an area and watching it build up very quickly, and then just wiping out every enemy in the vicinity with her miasma, combined with her spores, and then those spores spreading again to all the enemies outside of that radius and wiping all of them out. It's just incredibly, incredibly good. And you combine her Toxic Lash with a solid melee weapon and her 2's ability to speed you up and bring you from target to target very fast and spread these spores, and she's just hard to take down. Like, it's... the enemies just die too quickly to effectively be able to fight Sarin, and if they're not already dead, they're probably stunned by miasma. It is an incredibly synergistic and powerful kit that is at home in ESO mainly, which is, of course, one of the main farming places for getting a lot of shit done. If you need to farm focus, for example, Sarin and ESO, pretty much going to be what you're doing. Titania. So Titania, I will point out before we talk any further about this, is receiving some tweaks coming up soon, and she is getting a prime on the horizon here. But as it stands currently, she is moving up from a C+ just to a B-. The improvements that were made to her kit do matter quite a bit, and getting the damage reduction from her 2 is very nice, and I feel like she's likely to move up even further, as that damage reduction is going to be even easier to access whenever she receives a few more changes, but those changes are not in yet, so I can't expressly speak to them until they're actually in the game. But as it stands right now, she can DPS pretty effectively with her 4, and her 4 is very fast given the Augment Razorwing Blitz, and you're utilizing her 1 in order to keep those stacks very quickly, as this ability gets very cheap and also makes you immune to status, which is a nice combination with the damage reduction you're getting. And her 3 is about to get a lot better and probably be an effective crowd control ability, but of course right now it's kind of annoying to use. That's the thing they're fixing about it. So with that, I'm not going to spend any more time talking about Titania, and I'm just going to use this video to hope that the further changes to her kit are very good and kind of bring her into her own going forward. Let's talk about Trinity. Now, a lot of people are not going to like what I have to say about Trinity at current, but I am moving Trinity down from a previous A+ down to just an A. And the reason for that is that even though Trinity can offer a large damage reduction and full heals for usually the entire party, which is great, and she has a ton of damage reduction for herself, making it very, very hard for her to die, and Energy Vampire is essentially giving your entire squad unlimited energy as long as there's just one enemy to use this on. I think personally that stuff is at a way lower value than it maybe ever has been in the history of Warframe. What I mean by that is a lot of like the kind of primo DPS Warframes in the game have energy economies that don't need Trinity to sustain themselves, and those Warframes are generally tough enough without Trinity's blessing in order to just not need her around in general. Their energy economies are just fine. They don't need more survivability. And what they do need, Trinity can't provide. What that is, we're going to get into in a minute with a Warframe that is moving in on Trinity's territory. But I think it's fair to say that Trinity has moved down just a little bit. However, if we enter in again into a meta where we need all that energy, or we really need this extra defense, Trinity will be much more useful once again. But right now, it just isn't that way. Valkyr, my old favorite Warframe. Unfortunately, I am moving down from a B- all the way down to a C. And the reason for that is really that Valkyr is showing her age, and with the melee rework, it has only gotten worse. So many Warframes can do what Valkyr does better than Valkyr. Does she have a lot of damage on her 4? Yes. Does her 4 make her invincible while it's active? Uh-huh. Does she have a large attack speed buff with her 2? Yep. Absolutely accurate. Does she have anything else? No. And there are a number of Warframes right now that are totally invincible with upside that can hold a melee weapon. And her claws just aren't that much better than the good melee weapons that are already available in the game. She's perfectly usable, but just isn't really offering anything unique. If you are going to go with a just like tank-oriented melee Warframe, at this point, Goss is everything Valkyr can do plus 200%. And it's really unfortunate to say that Valkyr needs a lot of a rework in order to just come up to par with the current state of Warframes. Vauban. So, Vauban received a rework, and he was previously at a C+ ranking. But, unfortunately, all his rework really did was make it very obvious that he has a C- Warframe. There was... So that's really not... It's not fun to say that. But really, it made me play some Vauban and realize that he just is not very good. He has his 4, which is now his 2 good abilities he had before in 1 ability, which really shows off that he only has 1 ability. And then he has this new ability, Photon Strike, which is an airstrike that is like mediocre at best and very slow. And then he has Mind Layer, which has not a single effective ability in it. And he has the Tesla Nervos, which, while fun, not actually very good. So what it boils down to is that Vauban was reduced from having 2 good abilities, or maybe let's call it 1.5, down to just having 1 good ability that is those 2 old abilities combined. And that is just not enough. It is just so not enough for Vauban to be in the state that he's in, especially with another gadget Warframe on the horizon here and seeming to have everything that maybe Vauban would have wanted, but we haven't seen how that works out just yet. But yeah, unfortunately, I really just have to move Vauban down to a C-. He is very underwhelming, especially for a Warframe that just got a rework, as usually it goes pretty well. But yeah, moving on. Volt. So for Volt, basically nothing has changed. He just remains as a B+. He is an option for farming ESO. He can do some damage. He's used in the Eidolon parties. He can be pretty fast, although I would really suggest Goss over him for that kind of thing. He's usable in a lot of different places. He has solid enough abilities. In my eyes, he's not doing anything particularly special, but really his output just speaks for itself in terms of like what his kit allows him to do. It's just really not as flashy as it might look in this diorama is basically what I would tell you. But yeah, he's solid. Like he's got like his 2 to go pretty fast and do melee stuff, and like the reload speed's also pretty nice, and like his electric shield is the only ability that affects Eidolon hunts, so he really has that going for him in terms of a niche. And his 4 does solid enough DPS in like a lot of levels in Warframe, and ESO is a very important place to be able to farm, and he can succeed there. So yeah, that's really all there is to it for Volt right now. I kind of wish there was a little bit more. I wish he was a little bit more exciting for me personally, but he's one of the oldest Warframes in the game, so maybe his shine is just kind of worn off for me in the end. Moving on. Let's talk about Wisp. Wisp is a brand new Warframe, and her brand new ranking is A fucking plus. This Warframe is extremely good. This Warframe is the reason Trinity's rank got reduced, because what Trinity is not bringing to the table, Wisp is. Her 1 is the full support package by itself. It's a health moat that gives you a ton of health regeneration and a ton more base health, making it very, very hard for pretty much all Warframes to even consider the concept of death. Then she has her haste moat, which not only makes everyone faster, which is extremely valuable, it also makes everyone's fire rate and attack speed go up, including herself, which means she's a great melee Warframe to utilize. And she also has her blue buff, which is going to be a small lightning CC around her, mimicking kind of Mesa's 2, which is solid, and especially solid whenever everyone in the party has access to that buff at the same time. All that comes together for a really compelling support package, and that's just her first ability. On top of that, she has her Will-o'-the-Wisp ability, which, while active, she is invisible and it distracts enemies, and she is allowed to teleport with this ability, giving her a high amount of movement versatility whenever she needs it in certain areas of the game. That's great. Breach Surge is a large AoE stun that also allows her to teleport large distances as long as she has her 1 placed where she's trying to go. So that's extremely powerful. This debuff is great. And on top of all of that, she has her Soul Gate ability, which originally I wasn't so hot on, even though it literally has the power of the sun. But with the buffs to heat damage, this ability is actually considerably more effective at mowing down enemies, even at higher levels, and is an ability I would actually use in like a hallway type situation. If you have a hallway full of enemies, this will actually melt them because it is adaptive damage to what it is trying to fight. It's going to be corrosive when you need to get through armor and other damage types whenever you don't. And it is very, very powerful, and it gets buffed whenever you have your reservoirs on you. Wisp is an exceedingly good Warframe that I imagine, as long as she does not get nerfed, will see play for just absolute fucking ages. An absolutely incredible addition to the roster of Warframes. She's literally pushing other Warframes down by her inclusion because she is such a just good versatile kit that is also great by itself. Very big accomplishment in terms of how she is designed. Moving on. Wukong, the Monkey King. He really had a good run of it last year, but he couldn't make it. He couldn't make it to the next roster review in the state that he was in kind of the middle of the year. Wukong was a B-, and he remains a B-. But I need to tell the story of Wukong. There was a midpoint in this year where I toyed around with doing like a live Warframe roster review, and Wukong was pushing every other Warframe on this list down multiple grades because he was that good. Wukong was closing in on being an S-rank Warframe fast, but he got nerfed hard multiple times. His rework was immaculate. His 4 was exceedingly powerful. The new version of Defy was great for keeping him alive and also sometimes doing damage. And Cloudwalker was one of the fastest modes of transport in the game and amazing for speedrunning like every fucking mission in this game. And Celestial Twin was a solid support ability on top of that, utilizing how good his 4 was, and just also being able to just be an AI that can actually aim and shoot enemies. Unfortunately, his 2 has been nerfed significantly to not be even close to as fast as it was, and his 4 is just a victim of the melee rework and the death of condition overload, just absolutely killing the real viability of his 4, making it so you should just use a regular melee weapon instead. And with losing those 2 huge positives that he had, all he really has left is his Celestial Twin, because Defy is just not enough anymore. So basically, he's got an AI that runs around with him, and you can hit things with an okay stick now. It's a really, really unfortunate place for Wukong to be whenever he was a Warframe that was oppressing all the other Warframes. He could have been brought down just slightly, but he was brought down all the way back to where he fucking started pre-rework at the end of, at the beginning of the year. It's unfortunate. It's a really fucking sad state of affairs, because I was really enjoying extremely strong Wukong, but that's just not the way it is anymore, very sadly. So moving on, I guess. Finally, as we always do, let's talk about Zephyr. So Zephyr, I have kind of increased the harshness of my grading, as many of you guys have probably noticed from the rest of this list. And that, unfortunately, for Zephyr, moves her down from her previous B+ down to just a B-, which is really just due to her just not being very relevant. Like, she has her 3 for survivability, and you can use her 4 to crowd control, but it's a little inconvenient. And her 4 can also be used in some ways for damage, which is kind of nice, but again, a little inconvenient. And her air burst, being her new ability, is fine, but not amazing. And her 1 is a solid ability for getting around open worlds and stuff, but there are just better ways to do it. Zephyr is just kind of in a mediocre spot. There are some pretty simple ways I think that Zephyr could be a whole lot better and really come into her own and be a very effective Warframe for both defense and offense. But right now, the extreme awkwardness of her kit is really what's bringing her down at current, and keeping her from soaring, if you will excuse the bird pun. But yeah, that is going to do it for the Warframe roster review this year. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. And yeah, let me know what you guys thought in the comments. I'm thinking about doing some other videos that kind of go into more depth on what these Warframes are generally good at, doing like a tier list for different missions in Warframe and like who I'm bringing for these things. If you guys would like to see something like that, let me know in the comments. I'd be very interested in that. But yeah, that is the Warframe roster review for this year. Hope you guys have enjoyed it, and I will see you later.